Joining me now is Tarana Burke, author, activist, and founder of the global Me Too movement for survivors of sexual assault. She's become a global leader in the evolving conversation around sexual violence and the need for survivor-centered, survivor-led solutions. Tarana, it's a real honor to talk with you today. And you and I have talked before about the fact that the Me Too movement that a lot of folks know didn't start, with Hollywood. This has been something you started way, way back when. I think almost 15 years ago, of laying the groundwork and the scaffolding on how to get justice injected and accountability brought to sexual violence, sexual crimes, if you will. And I'd love you to give our audience an understanding of the journey you've been on since you founded Me Too.
Sure. Well, it's nice to talk to you again.
Yeah.
I started in about 2005, 2006. Really before that, before we had a name, I was doing youth work in Alabama. I'm from New York, but I went to college in Alabama and was part of a group there. But the work I was doing was really with community children, with young people in the community who had started off in my leadership program, and as I worked with the girls in particular, I kept finding more and more and more stories of sexual violence. And sometimes it would be stories that they didn't even realize were sexual violence that they had experienced. And as a survivor myself, it became clear that I needed to do something to fill the void. There were no resources, there was no conversation, there was just nothing happening to support the survivors of sexual violence that were there, the children. But even beyond that, my training as an organizer in that community and in general said that when there is a community problem, there should be community solutions. And there was nobody talking about what was the solution for this. How do we grapple with so many young people who have dealt with sexual violence? And as I started to develop Me Too as a program, and really started as workshops that grew into a program and eventually into movement work, it spread to adults. And I got to see firsthand just the breadth and depth of how sexual violence affects all of us in this country. And it became crystal clear that if we don't build a movement to end sexual violence and interrupt sexual violence and to support survivors, then we are going to be in a really, really, really worse off position in 10 or 15 or 20 years from now.
Tarana, you've just released your personal memoir, Unbound. I'll tell our audience, get it. Unbound, My Story of Liberation and the Birth of the Me Too Movement. And I don't know how to ask this, but I'm going to ask it. I said, I've known people who were victims of sexual violence, and that trauma that they experienced, and the fear of stigma, a lot of different dimensions to it, that it's so hard to turn from being a victim to coming out and being public and activist. It's more than just chasing who the perpetrators was. There's nothing. I'd love our audience to know what you went through to move from the side of the equation of being a victim and demeaned and all the issues you went through to becoming who you are today, of helping others find their way out of this nightmare.
Yeah, well, I was first sexually assaulted at 7, so this is a piece of trauma and violence that I've been carrying in my body for 40 years. And in that journey, and which I'm still on, I want to be clear with people that there's no sort of end result. This is a continuing journey. I had to go through a lot of healing work, personal healing work, that involved me doing sort of excavation, if you will, in my own life, to confront the trauma that I experienced, to confront the violence, but also to kind of slowly roll back the idea that it was my fault, that I should bear the shame and the guilt of what happened to me, because I didn't ask for it, right? And nobody does. And so that journey, going through that journey and watching young people who didn't have the benefit of those resources or the information I had, made me even more compelled to want to bring this to my community, right? There are all these things that exist out in the world to support survivors. Many of them never touched people who need them because they can't afford them, because they don't have access or information. And so I I used my journey and what I went through and the issues I had, the gaps and resources that I experienced to build an understanding of what was necessary to build a movement that really supported survivors. And that's why I talk a lot about what we saw after hashtag Me Too went viral, although it amplified the movement to end sexual violence, it really pushed focus to the wrong people. We forget that 12 million people responded to that hashtag in 24 hours, and yet we keep attributing the Me Too movement to celebrities and to perpetrators and people who cause harm, when in fact we wouldn't have a movement if it wasn't for the very brave, very bold, and probably very scared survivors who decided to share their journey with us and then looked around and said, oh my gosh, this happens to so many other people. People are looking for community. It's what I was looking for on my journey. It's what I tried to build when I started Me Too, and it's what we've seen happen over the last 4 years.
You know, you and I talked in Washington, D.C., and you were given a tribute when I was here one night for dinner, and I'm just interested in, I'm going to be blunt. I mean, I think anyone listening to your story, hearing this story, is going to, you know, their emotional, you know, dimensions are going to be stirred up, and they're going to be with you. But when it comes to public policy, when it comes to law, when it comes to legislators, both sides of the aisle, what's that picture like? Are the railroad tracks aligning, you know, when it comes to law and help and resources and the policy world to the world you're writing about?
Let me explain something. The thing that people don't get is that the sexual violence itself is so broad that it needs multiple interventions.
Right.
And so while we need people to be working on healing modalities for survivors, we need to be talking about resources to survivors and communities, but we have to have things happening on different levels, which means we need policy, we need laws, and we need people who will enforce those laws and who will enact those policies. We need that to happen at the same time that we have resources going to the people who are fighting sexual violence on the ground. And those things aren't aligning. This is not a partisan issue. There should be no two sides of the issue of ending sexual violence at all. It doesn't matter how you vote and how you align politically. This is an issue that doesn't discriminate. And so this should be a place where we come together. I actually felt really naive because people kept saying when it went viral, oh, there's going to be a backlash. And I thought, well, what's the opposite argument, right? If I say I want consent, what are you going to say? No, you know? But I have been mortified to see the way that politicians have responded and used this issue to their benefit on both sides of the aisle when it suits them. But when those of us who are fighting for justice, for survivors, fighting for legislation, fighting for policy, when we need them, when it's not useful, we don't have the same kind of response. So no, you can't adjudicate healing, and you can't, you know, legislate saving people from sexual violence. But everything that people can do who have power, they need to be doing. If you can pass a law, if you can create a policy, you need to not just do it, but you need to enact it when it's done. And then people need to embody the spirit of those laws, right? You can't just, we saw this with Cuomo, right? You can't just pass a law and then act the way you want to. You have to, as a lead, what we need from our leadership are examples of accountability, and they need to embody the ethos and the spirit of the same laws that they're putting into place. So until we have that, we have some work to do on the political front when it comes to sexual violence.
Well, it's very powerful, and this is too short a period of time. I just want to commend you on your book and commend you on your story and what you did so many years before, and the elevation of the Me Too movement in the authentic way at the beginning in 2006 and so on. Tarana Burke, it's such a pleasure. Tarana Burke, author, activist, and founder of the global Me Too movement. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our first segment today. A big thank you to our sponsors, Microsoft and Southern Company, and all of you for watching. Really big thanks to Eris Foley as well for joining me. She was fun, and I look forward to having her back. We're going to be back at 2 p.m. for our Focus segment. It's the second segment today, a band of great programming, and we're going to be focusing on securing energy networks from digital threats and feature Allison Clemons, Commissioner of the FERC, Senator Mark Warner, and more. Meet us right back here at 2 p.m. Eastern. See you then.